epistemological agility. You'll say, what can you gain by losing everything? What are you talking about? Are you crazy? Well, people from these upheavals, because they come close to death, they tell you, if we listen to them and we don't look only for their trauma and nothing else, they will tell you that actually they are looking at life in a new way. Because I've come so close to death, I look at my own previous values, and perhaps I don't want to waste my life anymore making money and neglecting my family or things like that. So there are a lot of things that I call adversity-activated development that has been exclusively
typically Canada
because of their exposure to adversity, and we should not forget that. Once we have that, then you have a dimensional way of looking at human beings, and not just simply as caricatures, negative effects, trauma, and nothing else. And why? Because it's to do with the identities that are developed, these kind of categorizations. Usually we have stable and dynamic identities that change according to situations and circumstances. The conditions of immense adversity, there is some sort of confusion about that. And what happens is that there is a tendency to create fixed and static and rigid identities. And often the identity people acquire in these situations is the victim identity. And the victim identity, it's a very dreadful consequence of these situations, and make a very sharp distinction between people indeed being victims of circumstances as opposed to developing a victim identity. And it's, again, very fine way of distinguishing this. And we need to have that fine distinction. Otherwise, we look at them as victims, period, and under the general identity of victims, they develop learned helplessness, they are passive, they feel entitled to everything, they don't take any responsibility. We should be very careful that there are a lot of negative effects of the victim identity. And it requires a lot of agility to see people as victims of circumstances, but not as victims. Yes, I'm a victim of earthquake, I'm a victim of this dictator, but I'm not a victim. Take some. Finally, to remind you, our usual way of looking at things doesn't address the complexities of these situations. For example, to begin with, refugees move from their home of origin with an intended destination, and that's all that there is in their mind. The origin is untenable, and the wonderful place that they're going to go is the intended destination. Along the way, what they see, what they do is that there is, the journey, the risks, and then this middle reality begins to grow, and it gets darker. And there are risks, there are dangers, there is uncertainty, there is disappointment, and it's getting darker and bigger, and there is despair, there is irritability, there is boredom, there is loss of direction, and they are lost. Nobody has bargained, nobody has conceptualized this huge chapter in being. They are thinking of the top, the beginning and of the end. What about the middle? We don't think about that often either. And this is what we need to have increasingly more agile epistemological sensitivities to discern the uniqueness of their situation. Because once they lost direction, they don't know how to deal with that. It's not just simply mental illness, but they lose their coping mechanisms, their basic values, their Weltanschauung, loss of their identity, they develop a victim identity, and all of these different situations. So essentially what I'm arguing for is for us to contribute, each one of us in our own modest way, towards changing the refugee discourse, the current discourse that today is dominated by the trauma of them, burnout of us, the spectacle of pity in the asylum politics, security economics, oversimplification, polarization, blame, impulsive conceptualization and action, and instead we need to develop new and creative ways of assisting complexities, bearing painful realities, compassion and dignity, thoughtful planning, collaboration and coordination. And once we begin to develop this, we can actually perhaps understand a little bit better the unique and individual predicaments that people find themselves. I'm ending with this graffiti which was on the island of Kos, which speaks for itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Papadopoulos. So from that very large framework, we're going to come to Ottawa. And we have with us Dr. Doug Gruner. He's a practicing physician and practices locally here in nearby hospital, Bruyère. And he's also a co-founder or founder of the Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care, which attained public attention and was very successful in countering the oversimplification of our own government under the last regime, if I dare call it that, which had caused a lot of harm in terms of removing medical and other assistance for refugee claimants who are here within our country, notwithstanding our international obligations and so forth. A campaign which Doctors for Refugee Care succeeded in with some assistance of people here at the University of Ottawa, I'm pleased to say. Dr. Gruner.
Our goal is to
address the complexities of this situation.
and that,
For example,
bringing this up can cause harm, especially if the individual is not ready to discuss issues. 2, it is crucial to ensure you have adequate resources in place to deal with the issue once interpretation resources. Access to mental health in Ottawa, to say the least. So how will our system be able to respond with so many vulnerable and at risk coming to our city? In effect, this crisis, if you will, provides us an opportunity to think how we deliver services in our community. For most refugees, there is a honeymoon period when they first arrive. With so many pressing issues to deal with in what seems like a short period of time, many simply push the mental anguish to the sidelines. Until one day, when the dust settles, the kids are all in school, housing has been dealt with, and the many other initial challenges away, the horrors of what they've experienced begin to surface. This is often when we see refugees present a crisis. 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the road. The levels of complexity are huge, including cultural differences, language barriers, and the stigma of mental health. I believe the best way to illustrate the challenges we face as a community in addressing mental health in our refugee population is to tell you a story. This happened just last month, of one man's mental health crisis. In the interest of confidentiality, I will just simply say he is from the Middle East and a recent arrival. As part of our outreach, our community service learning at the University of Ottawa, medical students do 30 hours of community service. Options to and refugee health as well. 2 of our students, with a cultural interpreter, went to this gentleman and his family. In discussing some of the migration story, it came up that he was depressed. So much so that he was thinking of suicide. There had already been one suicide As the discussion moved towards this topic, he asked his wife to leave the children to their rooms. He refused to do this in front of her children. This was clear in the scope of the students, who wisely called me to intervene over the phone and through the internet to understand the situation better. I learned that he had suffered from depression for close to 10 years in his country, that he received little to no medical care for this, that he would never see a psychiatrist, ever, because seeing a psychiatrist implied he was a crazy man. He could not talk to his wife because he did not want to upset her. He was suspicious of those in his own community. He did not trust them, and he was judged by them. So imagine, he was truly alone, with no real options, in a foreign land, with limited to no English or French. Hearing more, I asked our interpreter to assess his willingness to go to the hospital. Initially, he categorically refused to entertain this idea, and again was adamant he would never see a psychiatrist. He'd rather die. But I knew it was essential to have him assessed and treated because he had a plan. He was going to kill himself. Our interpreter was an international medical graduate and had excellent communication skills. She was instrumental in gaining his trust. He agreed to go to the hospital on the condition that he would not be admitted. His settlement worker who was involved agreed to meet our students at the hospital, and she actually stayed overnight. The doctors saw him and to help with his sleep, which was a significant factor in his depression. He agreed to see a psychiatrist, and in the end did have some follow-up arranged. Interestingly, he was very suspicious of the male interpreters and did not trust that they were actually relaying the information correctly to the physicians. He did not like the way they looked at him. As for the female interpreter, he initially put his trust in. He's not out of the woods by any stretch, but this is an example. Oh, I did that again. Sure. Anyways, it's that. This is an example of how our system can work, how a system can adapt to cultural differences. It is very much needs improvement. It needs resources to ensure that those improvements happen.